In 1991, I was one of the planners and implementers of Operation Desert Storm. Operation Desert Storm was a major military operation against the Iraqis. It kicked off with I believe, a 44-day strategic air campaign. We started off that air campaign by blowing up every means of communication, meaning we shut down the radios, we shut down the TVs, we shut down everything. We blew up all the bridges, we blew up all the highways, we blew up everything. Electrical generation plants, petroleum plants, fuel, and this went on for 44 days. And we slaughtered the Iraqi people, slaughtered them. It's not a violation of the war. Everything we bombed was a legitimate military target, but the point is, we killed a lot of Iraqi civilians. Now, the reason why I bring that in is Russia engaged in a major military campaign against Ukraine. You know what they didn't do? They didn't shut down cell phone service. They didn't shut down internet connectivity. They didn't shut down the railroads. They didn't shut down the highways. They let the Ukrainian people travel to and fro here and there. They allowed the president of Ukraine to get on video conferences with the United States Congress, with British Parliament, with the European Union, with NATO, video conferences that not only elevated his status as a leader, but generated billions of dollars of military aid that then flowed in, was turned over to the Ukrainian army and killed Russian soldiers. So the military imperative, the military necessity of shutting this down is real, but Russia didn't do it. Why? Because Russia isn't viewing this as a war like we viewed the war against the Iraqis. Russia is viewing this as a special military operation. People make fun of that word, but it's not war, because if it was war, Ukraine would be gone today, eliminated. You wouldn't recognize it. Unfortunately, it's getting that way because the way the Ukrainians have opted to defend means they're putting their military forces in residential areas, and those areas are getting bombed and destroyed and people are dying. But the original Russian approach was a very soft approach. They didn't use Russian doctrine of overwhelming military firepower, artillery that flattens everything, followed by a massed tank attack that runs over everything. That's not what they did. They actually came in with light infantry units up front who tried to negotiate their way through the towns and cities, meet with the elected officials and say, we're not a threat. Just let us go through and do our job. We won't bother you. You can continue to govern the way you want to govern. I believe the Russians were told by their intelligence professionals that they would be well received. The rumors are that Putin has arrested several of these intelligence officials because they got it wrong. And the Russians weren't well received, and the Russians lost a lot of men up front trying to come in soft. But the point is, the Russians have never changed their position, which is they are there not to defeat the Ukrainian people, but to defeat Nazis, to demilitarize, and to bring minimal harm. And we have written orders to this effect. Now, unfortunately, there's been fighting, and we see, there are civilian casualties and there are refugees. That is just one of the horrific realities of war, which is why the United Nations sought to ban war to begin with, and everybody should ensure that the last option is always military action, that we exhaust every venue short of war before we go to war, because war is horrible. War is awful. You don't want to glamorize war. You don't want to legitimize war, but it's happening right now. And we need to understand that the Russians have done everything humanly possible to minimize the damage that's been done to the Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. We see the Russian concern when you talked about it, Joe, about how before the war started, they began the evacuation of civilian populations out of the war zone, which is one of the things you are required to do under the international humanitarian law. That if you are going to wage conflict in an area where there are civilian structures, you have a duty and responsibility to get the civilians the hell out of there before the fighting starts. Because if you don't, then you're using them as de facto human shields. Well, guess who hasn't evacuated the civilians? The Ukrainians. And now we come to the opposite end. The Russians have gone out of their way to treat Ukrainian civilians with respect. What have we learned about the Ukrainian nationalists, the Nazis? They view anybody who collaborates with the Russians, any one of these mayors who said, yeah, come on in, keep going, we're not going to harass you, they are now collaborators who will be killed. And they are being killed. They're being arrested and assassinated by the Ukrainian government for the crime of collaboration. They're doing the same thing with people who receive Russian humanitarian aid. The Russians hand out these aid packets that are in little green boxes. They have a white star. You may have seen them. They say Voyintorg military store, but they hand them out their dry rations, and they give them to people who are hungry, who are starving. It is a crime to possess one of these. If you possess one of these and the Ukrainian National Police catch you, you are treated as a collaborator and you are killed. And this becomes important when we start talking about Bucha in a minute. But as this war goes on, too, we're seeing another thing, the displacement of people. People tend to run away from combat zones because most people are rational thinking people and they don't want to be around where shells are going off. So they flee, and they try to flee out of the combat zone, which means now millions of people are fleeing into Europe, into Poland, into Hungary, into Slovakia, into Romania, Moldova. They're fleeing there, and this creates a crisis of its own. And you talked about Article 4. You know, one of the big things about NATO, people talk about collective defense. An attack against one is an attack against all. That's Article 5. It only be invoked once, right after 9/11, and pretty much what was a propaganda show by the United States to show that the world was lined up behind it. They flew some airplanes over the United States for airborne warning, as if the terrorists were going to hijack even more aircraft, and they sailed some ships in the Mediterranean, but it wasn't real. But NATO's been at war many times. The other article that authorized NATO to go to war is Article 4, and that's basically where the members can consult with one another on matters of imminent security concern of one or more members. They've used that excuse to take on Serbia, to go into Libya, to go into Iraq after the invasion, to go into Afghanistan. And today they've convened Article 4. Poland and the Baltic nations have convened an Article 4 consultation, and they're talking about what can we do in Ukraine. NATO recognizes that if they send military troops into Ukraine, they lose Article 5 protection. So meaning that if Russia responds, you can't gin up the whole NATO group under Article 5, but you can gin them up under Article 4. And that's the danger. Right now, there's active discussions in NATO about creating a humanitarian buffer in Western Ukraine so that these refugees don't come into Europe proper. They're held in place in Western Ukraine, but they need to be protected, so NATO troops will come in. Initially, people said, well, that's insane, because if you do that, the Russians are going to attack, and now we're finding ourselves where two nuclear-armed opponents are facing off against each other at a time when they're both talking about using nuclear weapons. So there's been a lot of hesitation about getting people involved. But as this war progresses, and I believe it's going to get far worse before it gets better, there's going to be even more humanitarian pressure on Europe in the form of this wave of refugees, and there will be more pressure on Europe to do something about it, to include putting a buffer zone in that could lead to force-on-force conflict with Russians. But now we come to Bucha. Bucha was occupied by the Russians. The Russians, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Russia's been perfect. My experience in the military is no military is perfect, because it's composed of human beings who are subjected to some of the most horrific things in the world. Man killing man, or woman killing man, whatever. Human killing a human in a combat situation is murder. It's organized murder of the worst sort, and it's not easy to do. It's not something, and it's good that it's not easy to do, but when you get into a combat mode, and I speak of personal experience, you dehumanize the enemy because you go insane if you viewed them as human beings. So you dehumanize them to the point that you can kill them without thinking, without remorse. And if the second you lose that edge, you die, because the other guy hasn't. He's going to kill you. And when you get that way, you need discipline and you need leadership to be watching your men and women very closely to make sure they don't go over the edge. And it's tough. I mean, Michael Hare wrote a book called Dispatches about Vietnam. It's a classic book. It was quoted in Apocalypse Now, but the saying was, charging someone with murder in wartime is like writing speeding tickets at the Indianapolis 500. It just doesn't make sense, because war is about murder. Well, it's not. It's about murder of other combatants. It's not about murder of civilians. Sometimes civilians die. That's just the horrible reality of it. The modern military math is, generally speaking, in a modern conflict, for every combatant that dies, a civilian dies. So if we're in a war where 100,000 soldiers have died on both sides, you're probably going to have 100,000 dead civilians. That's just the way it works. But not in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the numbers are much higher for combatants killed than civilians killed. The number's still big for civilians, but the ratio is not 1-to-1. The ratio is like 7-to-1. 7 combatants for every single civilian killed. Why? Because the Russians are coming in soft. Even when most of the civilians are dying because the Ukrainians are digging into civilian neighborhoods, forcing the Russians to blow up buildings, put down artillery barrages, etc., killing civilians. But the numbers would be even lower if the Ukrainians obeyed the law of war. The reason why I bring this up is we're talking about mindset. We have one side that says we're trying to preserve human life, and civilian infrastructure. We have the other side that says if you collaborate with the Russians, you will be killed. I mean, it's written down. They've made videos. They talk about it. So now the Russians are in Bucha to withdraw, part of this withdrawal. While they were there for several weeks, the Russian military says we had good relations with the local people. It was peaceful. We traded our dry rations for their dairy products. So they had a system of barter set up. So the citizens of Bucha would give them eggs, milk, cheese, and the Russians would give them the dry rations, the flour, the salt, the sugar, the meat, etc. And this was going on. Then the Russians left. Anybody who engaged in that kind of interaction with the Russians was now viewed as a collaborator. We know this because the Ukrainian National Police have published an announcement that they are going into Bucha on April 1st to carry out a cleansing operation to liquidate the collaborators. All right, this is the exact opposite of the Russian approach, which is we treat everybody with respect and we try not to harm civilians. The Ukrainians are saying, if you cooperate with the Russians, you will die. They have a videotape of a senior political figure announcing on social media to the citizens of Bucha, stay in your homes. The National Police are carrying out a cleansing operation. Do not panic. Stay in your home. She repeats it over and over and over again. Why? Because the police are in the streets gunning people down, kicking in doors of people who are collaborating and killing them. And we know this is more than just a document and a videotape, because there's, a videotape of a lady speak, because we have videotape of them actually doing it. We have videotape of the Ukrainian police, especially an Azov group, proudly claiming that you're going on a safari. That's an important word, because when we talk about propaganda, how you take the language of one side, flip it and use it again, take your language, flip it and use it against the other guys. It's the Ukrainians who have a special unit. The name of the Ukrainian Special Police Unit that went into Bucha was the Safari Unit. And they were carrying out a safari to cleanse the pro-Russian collaborators. And cleansing means kill, not capture, kill. And they're doing it. And then they go around and they film the dead bodies and they say the Russians did it. Now, there's a couple of things about the dead bodies. One, most of them are wearing white armbands, which means that they were telling the Russians, we're on your side. Don't shoot us. All right. 2, near each body is a green dry ration box, which they were carrying when they got killed, and it's on the ground next to them. 3, when they didn't have the armband, it's because the armband had been taken off and used to bind their hands behind their back. These people were murdered, not by the Russians, but by the Ukrainians. And yet that's not the spin that we're getting right now. The spin we're getting is just the opposite. All the forensic data that's available right now strongly suggests that the Ukrainians are responsible for the death of these people in Bucha. There's no doubt about it. The other interesting thing is they're trying to say these bodies died. I don't want to get too graphic here, but I've been around dead bodies. All right. You shoot a body on March 19th and you leave it lying in the street in 50 and 60 degree weather until April 2nd, the body ain't looking like they're looking on TV. Bodies tend to bloat up. The clothing tends to tear because the body swells, and then the body bursts, and it's very disgusting. It's gross. It's fetid. It's putrid. It's not what you saw on TV. What you saw on TV were freshly killed human beings. And we have another piece of evidence that more people need to pay attention to. A Mexican journalist gained access to Bucha on the same day that the Ukrainians were declaring this. And he filmed the bodies, fresh blood. He sat there and said, these people are freshly killed. This is fresh blood. Body ain't laying there since March 19th. It has fresh blood. These people were murdered on April 1st by the Ukrainian National Police. And yet we have the President of the United States coming out and saying that this is a war crime perpetrated by the Russians and Vladimir Putin needs to be brought to justice in The Hague. This is a propaganda war unlike anything we've seen in modern times, because it's not just about manufacturing a case for war. This is about an outright lie about murder, which makes us complicit in the crime, us being Americans, because that's our president who's facilitating the crime.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Yeah, and likewise in Mariupol, you know, there's people have been saying the 8th Battalion took over the theater, they took over the maternity hospital, you know, that there's witnesses from that region as well. But I want to get into more of the military situation there. You said Russia's winning. That's not what we're hearing in the corporate media in the United States. Recently, I guess they launched into the second phase of their operation. If you could talk a little bit about why you believe Russia's winning and what they're doing right now.
Yeah, we'll talk about a couple things. One, we'll talk about the concept of maneuver warfare. It goes back to the ancient Greek times, the phalanx. Let's talk about Napoleon. The American Civil War in the early stages. You had lines of troops marching, and most people say, well, that's pretty brutal. It's line against line. But actually, if you look at it on a map, as they diagram most battles, you get to see certain things. For instance, the notion of fixing an opponent in place. If an enemy has a big concentration here, and I put a big concentration up opposite him, he can't move his troops because he's threatened by my troops. I've fixed him in place. I can then do a feint. I can move troops over here in this direction, and he has to respond to that, move his own forces in that direction. That is a feint. I can then do a deception attack. That is, I can launch an attack here, maybe at odds that aren't favorable to me, but he has to respond to that by bringing in troops to respond to that. And then I can do pincers. While I've shaped the battlefield in this way, I take my other troops and I surround them. And now I can kill them all. That's Napoleonic warfare in a nutshell. And it worked that way in World War II. We saw massive battles of maneuver and encirclement fought throughout Russia between the Germans and the Soviets from 1941 up until 1945. Major maneuver warfare. We saw that in the Gulf War, the war that I was involved in. We used feints. We used deception attacks. We used fixing attacks. And we used large maneuver operations, the great left hook, the Hail Mary, remember, that rolled everybody up. And the reason why I bring that up is this is simple military science. And you know who some of the greatest students of military science in the world are today? The Russian officer class. I mean, we treat them like they're kindergarten kids. I mean, the way we talk about them, the Russians, they don't know what they're doing. They're some of the best trained, best educated officers you'll ever meet. They know this stuff better than we do. You want to know why they know it better than we do? Because they haven't spent the last 20 years learning how to kick down doors in Iraq and murder an Iraqi family, or crawl through the hills of Afghanistan and kill a goat herder, because that's what we've been doing for 20 years. We don't know how to wage large-scale military war. We forgot how to do it. I used to do it for a living. Spent all my military life training to do this. And even then, I can't say I was perfect at it, but I thought I was ready for it. And I proved I was during the Gulf War. But my point is, we're not ready for it today. We don't train this way. The Russians do. They think this way. So when you take a look at their map, we have a bunch of small arrow people. That's why I call the Americans, who are looking at tactical situations. They look at a videotape that shows a destroyed Russian convoy. They look at a videotape that shows 3 or 4 Russian tanks with guys sprawled out. You know what? War is hell. And when you go to war, people die, including your own. And if you're looking at small arrows, the Russians got slapped around on a couple small arrows. But now we look at the big arrows. The big arrows, what did the Russians want to do? I told you, they wanted to fix people in Kiev. There's 100,000 troops in Kiev that if you don't threaten them, they move down and reinforce. So you drive down from Belarus with 40,000 men and you hold 100,000 in place. You have 80,000 people in Odessa. So you send 30,000 people from Crimea to threaten Odessa while you sail ships with Marines off the coast. And now those troops are stuck. You have 100,000 people in the Donbass, and you don't want to free them up to respond to Kiev or the other. So you fix them. You send the Donetsk and the Lugansk militias across the border in some of the most difficult fighting imaginable, and you grab onto these people and you hold them in close combat so they can't maneuver. And then you use thrust to seize a land bridge between Crimea and Russia proper so that you can freely move your forces in between. Mariupol was the key to that. Mariupol had to fall. It's the only city the Russians have fought for. Ask yourself why, because it's the only one that matters. All the other cities don't matter. You're not going to take a city of 3.1 million, Kiev, with 40,000 troops. Ain't going to happen. You're not going to take a city of 1.6 million people, Kharkiv, with 50,000 troops. Not going to happen. But you are going to take a city of Mariupol with 50,000 troops because you're going to surround it and pound it, which is what has happened here. They've taken the town. Horrible, horrible, horrible situation, but military necessity dictated that outcome. But my point is, this phase that I'm talking about is called preparing the battlefield. And the other thing that's happened here is the Russians they have blown up virtually all the fuel depots in Ukraine. I don't mean to chuckle about it, but it's important because what does a tank run on? Gas. What does a truck run on? Gas. What is a tank that doesn't have any gas? A coffin. What is a truck that doesn't have any gas? Another coffin. All the ammunition depots have been blown up. What's an artillery piece without ammunition? An invitation to be killed. All the water and food and everything that nurtures the troops. What's a hungry soldier and a thirsty soldier? Either dead or a prisoner. So the Russians have been shaping this battle, denying maneuver to the Ukrainians while achieving their localized objectives to prepare for the major pincer operation that's going to trap a Ukrainian force that has been starved, denied water, denied leadership, denied fuel, denied ammunition. That's phase two that's happening around. The Russians left Kiev because they don't need to fix those troops anymore. Those troops can't move because they don't have any gas. So they're stuck. And if they try to move, the Russian Air Force is going to kill them all because they have to get on a highway and they'll all die. And that's what we see. They've tried to move convoys down and the Russians take them all out. There's no reinforcement taking place. The troops that are in Donbass can't maneuver. They're trapped. And now the Russians are coming in and they're going to close a pincer and they're going to kill or capture the bulk of the Ukrainian army. And when that happens, there's nothing left. Nothing left. And then the Russians will be able to dictate any outcome they want. That's why I say the Russians are winning, because that's the way I see the battle. I don't misinterpret things such as, well, the Russians failed to take Kiev. The Russians never wanted to take Kiev. Well, the Russians have failed to take Odessa. They never wanted to take Odessa. These were purely diversionary actions designed to fix in place significant numbers of Ukrainian troops to keep them away from the main effort. And that's why I say that the Russians are winning this war, and they're going to win this war very soon.
Thank you, Scott. There's a lot more that can be said about this. It was interesting today. I read that there was surrender of a number of Ukrainian troops in Mariupol, which I thought was interesting that that's starting to happen, and we're starting to see that.
Elite troops, I need to add. They're not just any. These aren't just average Ukrainian troops. These are elite. These are the Marines.
Yeah.
Which means that if you have a situation where Marines are surrendering en masse, what does that tell you? They have no food, they have no ammunition, they have no fuel, they have no water, they have no hope. So if you can get elite troops to surrender, the ones that normally fight to the death, but they're surrendering now, imagine what the non-elite troops are thinking.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the economic situation. I know this is not your area of expertise, perhaps, but I know you've been studying a lot of the war situation. The U.S. mainly said we're going after Russia with sanctions. The U.S. has, about 42 countries in the world on sanctions, and they're all working on ways around these sanctions. It's clear that Russia prepared for this. And we said the ruble was going to go through the floor. But what we're seeing now instead is the ruble is getting pretty strong. countries are starting to trade with the ruble. It's becoming more of an international currency. The dollar is weakening. We're seeing inflation in the United States. We're being hurt by the wheat that both Ukraine and Russia had, as well as the lack of fuel. And more than us, Europe is in terrible situation. I have no idea what the hell they're doing in Europe, because German industry is one of the few Western countries that's still industrialized, is going to die. It cannot function without the fuel that it's been getting, and yet they're still pushing ahead with this. I think under the reins of the United States. So, and perhaps the outcome of this is the hegemony which the U.S. had in control of the World Bank and the IMF, and the dollar being the currency for trade, is being lost. And that hegemony is being challenged from the East, Russia and China. And it's clear that Russia and China have made deals, and we're talking while the U.S. was boycotting the Olympics, doing a boycott. They were there talking. You know, I mean, it's almost foolish to think about what's happening. What's your thoughts on this? Are we going to end this war with a new economic reality throughout the world? And has this been a major mistake on the part of the United States and Europe, or where do you see this going?
I'll start here rather than going all the way back. I'll just go back to February 4th of this year. Okay, so that way we February 4th. What's important about February 4th is that Vladimir Putin traveled to Beijing, China, where he met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping to start the Winter Olympics. This is the one that the U.S. boycotted, the West boycotted, everybody boycotted. Strategic error on their part. Putin and Xi met, and their meeting produced a 5,000 plus word joint statement. And this joint statement was interesting on a number of fronts. Strategically, right off the bat, the big item that comes out of the joint statement is that Russia and China have agreed that the rules-based international order that the United States has been selling as the end-all. You hear it in every, even General Miley, who the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified before the Senate, I believe, today or yesterday, and here's a military man talking about the need to defend the rules-based international order. What that is in short, one word is American hegemony. That's two words, so that's Marine math for you. But American hegemony is what the rules-based international order is. It's how the United States dominates the world. It's the system we put in place at the end of the Second World War, not only to rebuild the world, but to control the world, control the world's economy. It promised not to do history, but George Kennan wrote something called the Long Telegram that was used as a document. He wrote it in, I think, 1948, 49, 46, maybe later, but in the 40s. And he said this is a document that became famous because it became the foundation of the American policy of containment that led to the creation of NATO and the Cold War. But Kennan wasn't writing about the military. Kennan was writing about the economy. He said that the Russians aren't buying into the American effort to impose a dollar-based economic control over the Soviet Union through the Marshall Plan and aid. The Russians rejected that. The Soviets rejected that. He said, by rejecting that, they're rejecting our control of the world scene. Therefore, we are going to be in perpetual conflict with the Soviets on economic issues. And he was right, because they're not going to surrender. They didn't surrender until 1990. Then they surrendered. We saw what happened to Russia once they surrendered. But my point is that the United States have been using this rules-based international order to control the world, not to help the world, to control the world to America's sole benefit. It's all about us, not about anybody else. If other people profit from it, great, but we don't care. We want it about us. And you see this with, the arrogance of Joe Biden, telling the German premier, the chancellor, you can't have a pipeline with Russia. You have to shut it down, even though it's going to destroy your economy, because it's not good for us. What kind of hubris is that? It's the hubris that comes from thinking that you are the world's essential nation, that the world can't exist without you. But guess what? Russia and China can exist. And they reject this, and they formally said, there will be no more unilateral world. We will no longer recognize the United States as the singularity around which the world gravitates. It's now going to be a multipolar world, one that is a law-based international order, the law being the United Nations Charter, meaning Russia and China aren't trying to rewrite the system. They're embracing the system the world agreed upon in 1945. They're saying this will be it, but it's going to be a United Nations where we have multiple poles of influence, like the BRICS, Brazil, South Africa, India, Russia, China. Imagine that. Everybody is equal. Imagine that. and they also said, you know, this concept of American economic hegemony that's linked to this transatlantic alliance. No, we're focused on a trans-Eurasian economic union that connects Russia with China through Central Asia and through India, Pakistan, inclusive of the Indo-Pacific region, reaching into Africa. Basically, 2/3 of the world's population is part of the Russian-Chinese economic union. Now, this is a statement, when I heard it, I sat up and went, this is one of the most fundamentally important documents in modern history, because it represents a complete revolution, a departure from the US dominance of the world. But the problem with a paper revolution is it's meaningless. It's hard to implement on its own. You need a push. And Russia and China weren't going to start the push on their own. The United States started the push. How? The United States has been sanctioning everybody for years, and they never work. But we had told Russia, if you remember, Biden had that summit with Putin in June of 2021 in Geneva. You know, the one where he famously looked Putin in the eye and called him a soulless killer, and I mean all this other tough talk. But the other thing he did is he looked Putin in the eye and said, "If you invade Russia, we're going to hit you with the most massive sanctions you've ever seen. It's going to hurt you, man," or whatever. How Biden never talks. But he's going to bring pain. The pain is going to be brought down. And Putin saw him, and Putin heard. Well, yeah, Putin saw him, Putin heard. Putin went back to Moscow and said, "Hey, if we go into Ukraine, they're going to hit us with sanctions. What do we do about it?" And they prepared. And one of the ways they prepared, and this is where the ignorance of the United States comes into play. Because of the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the American economic exploitation of Russia, Russia had become inexorably intertwined with the Western economy. About 20 to 25% of the Russian middle class is linked to the West economically, culturally, and you can't divorce that. If Putin ever said, "I want to cut relations with the West," he'd be voted out of office, because this group is a politically empowered group that isn't going to play ball. They want relations with the West. You have the oligarch class that, again, Yeltsin breathed life into. These are very corrupt people who stole the national wealth, made it their own, and enjoy monopolies. When Putin came to power, he said, "I understand I can't shut you down because you control our economy. I'm going to let you stay in the economy, but you're out of politics. If you stick your nose into politics, I cut you off the knees." And he did. He took over Gazprom. He kicked or Lukoil, I think, and he kicked the oligarch out of the country. Several of them fled, but many of them there. A lot of people talk about, the ignorant people say Putin needs the oligarchs, that he's part of the corruption of the oligarchs. No, Putin hates the oligarchs. He just can't get rid of them because economically they're too ingrained. Well, what did Biden do? First of all, he broadcast what he was going to do. So Putin was able to get a plan. And then he did what he said he was going to do. Cut off the economic system, a complete economic divorce with Russia, between the West and Russia. He just did Putin a favor. Had Putin initiated that divorce, people would be in the streets rioting, he'd be out of office. But the United States initiated the divorce, and Putin went, "Thank you very much, we're done with you. We're finished. We are never again going to allow Western economy to be able to dictate to Russian national security interests. It's a divorce, full, final, and complete goodbye. And the Russian people are like, oh my God, but the West did it. You can't blame Putin. What else did we do? We seized all the assets of the oligarchs. Guess who don't have any money anymore? The oligarchs. And without money, you think they got power? Putin gave a speech a couple of weeks ago where he told them, get the hell out of Russia. He's talking to the oligarchs. Leave. You're not real Russians. You've been stealing from us. You've been living a life of luxury, and we no longer need you. We no longer want you. We did Putin the greatest favor he ever had. We've empowered him in a way that was unimaginable because he was trapped by the Western economy, by the interlinking between Russia and the West. No longer. It's a divorce. And it's a divorce that's coming out in his favor. You remember how Biden bragged? I collapsed the ruble, as if that's something really cool to do. I collapsed the stock market. Just let's put on our humanitarian hat. That's a word we like to use. How would we feel as Americans if a foreign power on a whim decided to shut down our economy? We're all unemployed now. We don't have a paycheck, but we still have mortgages, so we're going to lose our homes. We have kids in college that can't go to college anymore because we don't have any money. We're going hungry. We're homeless, all because some idiot overseas decided he wanted to shut down our economy. Well, that's what we were doing to the Russians. So any American who sits there and says, no, we need to do that, really? We need to screw 139 million people like that? You would never tolerate it happening to you. That's what we were doing to the Russians. But fortunately for the people of Russia, Putin was told in advance what we were going to do. So he sat there and he said, really? You're gonna seize my sovereign wealth fund that's composed of euros and dollars in your banks that I use to pay off all my debt and make our economies interact? Thank you. Because what I'm going to do now is empower the ruble. You guys got a dollar that's worthless. It's based upon a debt-run economy, a petroleum dollar that we're going to rip away because the world's not going to be paying for petroleum dollars pretty soon. They're going to be using other currencies like, imagine, the ruble, which is now linked to the gold standard. Russia's been stockpiling gold for 20 years under Putin, and they got a whole bunch of it, and he just linked the ruble to gold. And guess what the ruble's doing today? It is more powerful now than it has been in a long time. We collapsed the Russian stock market, not on your life. Look at it, up 4, 5, 6, 8% per day. It's doing well. You know who's not doing well? Europe. Europe is hurting bad. Why? Because the United States promised things we couldn't deliver. We promised them that we will get them the oil, the coal, the gas they need. We had a plan B. Turns out we didn't have a plan B. We can't get them what they need. And if they cut themselves off from Russia, their economies literally shut down overnight. Not just temporarily. German economists are warning Chancellor Scholz that this could be a permanent damage to the German economy. It will never recover. This will be worse than the Second World War. And that's what's about to happen to Germany. That's what's about to happen to France. That's what's about to happen to all of Europe, except those countries that has said, yeah, we're going to play ball. Hungary ain't going to suffer because Hungary just agreed to buy all their energy in rubles, which is the other thing that Putin said. He said, you want to cut me off my sovereign wealth? Okay, I don't care about dollars and euros anymore. Get rid of them. I don't want them. I only care about one currency. That's the ruble. And if you want my gas, you got to pay me in rubles. It's a brilliant move. Putin has literally checkmated the West on their economic sanctions. Is there some belt tightening in Russia? Yeah. But right now, I guarantee you, if you go to a Russian supermarket, there ain't no empty shelves. Go to a German supermarket. Shelves are empty, man. They got nothing. And I don't mean to gloat because I have family that lives in Europe and all this, and I feel sorry for the civilians. But this is, I'll leave you with this. Most people who are watching this are old enough to remember the election of Bill Clinton in 1992. And he had an advisor named James Carville. And Clinton was running around talking about foreign policy and this and that, to save the world, all this. And Carville said, shut up, man. There's only one thing to get you elected. It's the economy, stupid. People vote their pocketbooks. And you want to talk about a path out of this predicament? Every single one of these European nations are ostensible democracies. And I can guarantee you that Scholz's political future is very short. If the German economy collapses, there will be an immediate vote of no confidence in the German parliament. He will be tossed out, and they will bring in a politician who will focus on, saving the German economy. And that means all this sanction nonsense is over. That means all this artificial propping up of a neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine is over. And Russia was planning on this. Right now, NATO's saying, hey, we're strong, we're more united than ever. No, you're not. You're not united when 4 NATO members disregard the sanctions and are buying gas in rubles. You're not united when Turkey blames this war on NATO, not on Russia. You're not united when Germany is going to be pulling out of this whole arrangement pretty soon. NATO is weak, and this is the Russian plan. The Russians have 2 major objectives now from this. One, after the Ukrainian victory, one is a new European security framework that respects the legitimate national security interests of Russia, that keeps NATO away from its borders. This is going to happen within the next 5 years because Europe cannot sustain this American vision of a strong NATO. How is Germany going to pay $100 billion to rebuild their military when their economy is in the dirt? Ain't going to happen. United States, General Walters, the commander of the U.S. forces in Europe, testified before Congress, and the Congress said, frying them out. We're giving you $839 billion, so you're going to send troops over to Europe, right? He said, no, we're going to wait until after Ukraine settles down. Why? Well, because this is a political problem. Who's going to invite us? Well, don't they want us there? Maybe not. And even if they do want it, who's going to pay for it? Because we're not paying for it. It costs over $2 billion a year to have pre-positioned equipment for 1 American brigade in Poland. And we're talking about sending over 8 brigades. That's $16 billion just to house them. Now you got to feed them. You got to train them and equip them. Who's going to pay for that? Because the American taxpayer ain't paying for that. Europe will have to underwrite it, and no European country can afford that. So this concept of NATO unity is a farce. Russia will impose, I believe, a new European security framework on Europe in the next 5 years. It could be very risky, though, because if Finland and Sweden decide to join NATO, that complicates things. But I have confidence that the Russians have a plan. Why? Because they said they have a plan, and Putin don't bluff. And then the other thing is the strategic shift away from American domination. The age of American hegemony is over. We're the Titanic. We've hit the iceberg. The iceberg is called Russia and Ukraine, and we are in a long, slow process of sinking. It's over. China right now has learned something. And their Chinese ambassador gave us a heads up. Before the Putin meeting, the Chinese ambassador spoke with NPR, and he said, relations with the U.S. and China are very bad. And if they don't change, if the U.S. continues to float around like it's a power, there will be a war with the United States. He said it right up front. There will be a war with the United States. And then they entered the special relationship with Russia. Russia entered the special relationship knowing that China's going to war in Taiwan and they're going to fight the United States, and Russia didn't walk away from that. Think about that for a second. And then Russia turned around and invaded Ukraine, and China isn't walking away from Russia. Sadly, something that's probably going to happen in the next 5 to 7 years is China's going to invade Taiwan. And there's not a darn thing the United States can do about it. The world is fundamentally changing. Here's the other truth. It didn't need to happen. This war in Ukraine did not need to happen. This could have been solved peacefully. Nobody needed to die. Nobody needed to die, but American hubris and the power, the greed for power started this war, and it's going to cost Taiwan. Taiwan doesn't need to be invaded by China, but they're going to be invaded by China. Hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese are going to die because the United States thinks it has a right to dictate outcomes to other nations. When the reality is, China right now would accept Taiwan to join China as it is. No fundamental changes. Keep the government, keep the economy, keep whatever you want. You will wake up the next morning and there will be no change except that you will be flying the Chinese the flag of mainland China, not the Taiwanese flag. You really want to die for a piece of cloth? One that the United States isn't going to back you up on? If Taiwan has learned anything, the United States is the worst friend in the world. Ask the Ukrainians how good of a friend we are. We're willing to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian, and we'll be willing to fight the Chinese to the last Taiwanese. That's the sad thing. And if you're anti-war, this has to be the biggest nightmare in the world, because we're seeing a major war in Europe that should have been avoided, and we're going to see a major war in the Pacific.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. And I wanted to mention that, you talked about sanctions, and in reality, most of them are what we call unilateral coercive economic measures. They're not legal structures. They're illegal economic measures imposed unilaterally by the United States on other countries, and mostly countries in the global South. More than a third of the world's population, more than a third of the countries we're sanctioning are in the African continent. And the global South is not going along with the US on this. Everything that we've done has been to isolate us and undermine ourselves and show that we can't be trusted. I interviewed Michael Hudson a few weeks ago, and he basically said March 23rd was the day we seized the Russian assets after seizing Venezuela's and Afghanistan's. The whole world now sees it. You can't trust the United States. So this is a game-changing situation. There's a number of things I would like to talk a little bit about Biden. Some of the things that he said, if you could comment on. He's talked about, we just have to pay these higher fuel prices. We're all going to have to pay higher prices for food as a result of this. This is just the price that we pay. He's talked openly about, pretty strongly alluded to wanting regime change in Russia. And you've talked about Biden's role in Ukraine and in the coup in 2014, and the ways that he's compromised in terms of Ukraine. So if you could talk kind of about your take on Biden and all of this.
Well, I think in fairness to full disclosure, I have to say that I don't like Joe Biden, and my feelings for him are deeply personal. They go back to the fall of 1998, when I resigned from the United Nations. I testified before the United States Senate, and Joe Biden behaved in probably one of the least professional appearances of his entire unprofessional career, mocking me, mocking what I was trying to do, calling me Scotty boy, saying that it was above my pay grade. That's why other people get the limos and I don't. I'm just saying that I'm as human as the next person, and that didn't sit well with me. And so I've never really recovered from that. And then I also haven't recovered from his role in greenlighting the war on Iraq. He was in a unique position to stop that war. He could have held kind of hearings. He could have educated the American people about the reality of the threat posed by Iraq, or the lack of threat, and the real situation about WMD. And he chose not to. He chose to maintain a lie. The other thing we'll say about Joe Biden is he is a natural born liar. And I'm not going to get into the pettiness about his plagiarism and things like that. I'm talking about big picture lies. And I'll give you a recent example. In July of last year, we had a situation where Biden made a decision he's going to pull out of Afghanistan. And he was starting to do that. And the internal security situation in Afghanistan was falling apart. Ashraf Ghani, the Afghan president, called Biden. And he panicked. He said, I got 15,000 Taliban and Pakistani insurgents pouring over the border. My army's on the verge of collapse. If you don't continue to give us air support, it's going to be over. We're going to be gone in a matter of days. And Biden shut him up and said, whoa, you can't say that. What I need you to do, and this is virtually a direct quote, people can look it up and see if I'm not exaggerating. What I need you to do is go out and say everything's okay. Everything's under control. And here's the important one. Even if it's not true, we need to create the perception of control. So he's ordering someone to lie, not just to his own people, but in a statement that'll be heard by the American people. So they're lying to the American people. And he's saying this to achieve a perception that deviates from reality. That's Joe Biden. He is a liar. On Ukraine, he is compromised every which way but Sunday. We saw his involvement in the Maidan. He was involved, in shaping the Ukrainian government. We saw his direct interference with the prosecutor case. Where he bragged, "Son of a bitch, $1 billion." I mean, that's what he did. That's what he does. I'm not going to get into his son, except what the hell is this son who has no qualifications doing at on the board of a major energy money laundering group. Burisma is not a legitimate energy broker. It is a money laundering machine, specifically there to create a mechanism to buy American politicians. You'll be surprised how many photographs you see of all these officials that are on TV today talking about the great, wonderful Ukrainian democracy. They all have photos in their photo album, because I've seen them, of them sitting there at a Burisma site with a Burisma jacket on it, and in their pocket is a nice little Burisma check, because they're all bought and paid for. Burisma owns everything directly or indirectly, because that's what the Ukrainian government created them to do. Biden is corrupt. I'm not going to say that he is personally corrupt, but he's intellectually and morally corrupt on the issue of Ukraine. And therefore, you know, if this was any other situation, he would have to recuse himself from this. But he's the president of the United States, so he can't recuse himself. But you know, we are married to a policy that makes no sense. Literally, our Ukrainian policy makes no sense. It's not good for Ukraine, and it's no longer good for the United States. I mean, all the corruption money that we used to have that bought off our politicians, that's going to be gone. And the people that are caught in the middle are the Ukrainian people. I mean, no matter where you stand on the issue of Stepan Bandera, the Nazis, whether Russia's right or wrong, my God, if you're not crying every night for the people of Ukraine, you're not human, because they don't deserve this. And yet this is their lot. There's a lot of other people. I see a lot of statements about Palestine. I don't want to get into that because that's a totally separate subject. But yes, the Palestinian people are suffering every day, and they should not be ignored. The people of Yemen are suffering. The people of Iran are suffering. The people of Venezuela are suffering. Everybody who is put on the receiving end of American corrupt policy, because there is no uncorrupt American policy. Everything we touch breaks and dies. And most of those policies were crafted by Joe Biden, who's been involved in policy formulation and implementation for nearly 5 decades. Everything he touches dies, literally. He's the commander-in-chief. He's the guy we got. I don't know if I answered your questions. I might have gone off on a tangent there. I apologize.
So, Scott, do you have a last closing thought?
It's one that I mean, I'm going to say I'm uncomfortable in this position. Meaning, you know, is a voice that people are listening to, and maybe taking everything I say at face value and as the gospel. Because if you're doing that, you're committing the same mistake I believe Americans make when they watch mainstream media. You know, nothing's the gospel. So tonight, what I would ask the people listening in is to treat me instead as an agent of propaganda working on behalf of the United States government to disseminate disinformation. Don't believe a word I said. Assume everything I said was a lie. Write down what I said and go out and research it and try and prove me wrong. And if it turns out that what I said was right, great. Now you've empowered yourself by doing your own research into a topic, and now you have some information that isn't just derived from listening to somebody say something, but you actively researching the topic and getting to know it. And if you do that, I think we've done a great service here, because democracy dies the moment the citizens stop becoming informed constituents. We inform ourselves not by listening to others, but by actively participating in a process of debate, dialogue, and discussion that empowers us with knowledge and information so that we can hold those whom we elect to higher office accountable for what they do in our name. And I think that this has been a very valuable forum for that. I thank you very much for inviting me here. But again, I just ask everybody who watched, go out and do your own research and view this as a jump start to it, but not as the end all. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Margaret, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, and Scott, I want to thank you so much. I know it's not a fun position to be in, but we really appreciate your courage and integrity in speaking out on these issues and educating us. I just, I want to thank everyone for being here, because it's so critical that you took the time to be here and learn this information. And now you have a task, which is to go and share this information with others. I've seen a lot of people concerned about being able to share this. Yes, this will be up on YouTube. It's up on the UNAC Facebook page. People have been sharing it out. We'll have a copy of the chat that folks will get access to. So, so you will have this, you will be able to share it out, but it's so important that we cut through the lies that are being told, the blatant lies that are getting people to cheer us into a major conflict. And we didn't even get a chance to talk about that. And maybe we will be able to do a second session. People have been asking about that, so we'll have to discuss the possibility of that. But I think this is the world is changing right now in a way that it was, many were predicting, but it's happening very quickly. And so it's up to us to educate people, to cut through the lies, and to continue to put pressure, raise awareness and put pressure on our own government to stop the destructive acts that we're taking. So I want to thank everyone for being here, and I'll stop there and get off my soapbox. But thank you, Scott.
I want to thank everybody too. And thanks, Scott and Margaret, of course. It's important that we get together and we discuss this stuff and talk about the truth. I'm sure everyone is feeling like I'm feeling, that when we see the truth of what's going on in Ukraine, and have studied it a little bit and tried to speak about it, they try to shut us down. They try to shut us down by closing our Twitter accounts. We haven't mentioned that Scott was closed down today. They took him off Twitter. All of us censor ourselves a little bit. On Facebook, I know that if I put something that looks violent, they're going to stop me. So we tend to censor ourselves, and it's difficult. So it's important that we get together, and it's also really important that we keep on speaking truth to power. We're going to win this. We're going to win this whole propaganda war. We're going to win the war that will change our society to one that is beneficial to all the people. But we have to do it, and we have to stay together. And we do hope to continue to do these things. We have to. This is a situation that's changing very, very rapidly. And what's going to happen at the end of it is going to require a lot of thought and a lot of people getting together and organizing to make sure that we can live well, that the people in Ukraine can live well, the people in Russia can live well, and we can have a world that's seriously a world of peace and justice, which is what we're all fighting for. So thanks again. You'll see this information I talked about soon. Keep in touch with UNAC at unacpeace.org. Margaret, you wanted to say what Popular Resistance URL is, or put it in the chat?
Oh, yeah, popularresistance.org, and check out our podcast, Clearing the Fog.